Some women are broken by the dark. Others learn to read it like a ledger. Every debt, every silence, every threat recorded in careful columns until the balance finally tips. Tavita had been keeping accounts her whole life. She knew at 7 years old that her Uncle Brendan spent $43 on cigarettes the week her mother couldn't afford school lunch. She knew at 12 that the food bank on Hastings opened at 8, but the line started at 6:15. She knew at 17 that the cost of being invisible in a house full of people who resented you was learning to make yourself smaller than the space you occupied, quieter than the pipes, cheaper than the electricity, easier to overlook than the stain on the kitchen ceiling nobody ever fixed. She was very good at not being seen. It turned out that skill had a price, too. The office smelled like old paper and mildew, and the particular exhaustion of a business that had been bleeding money for 3 years without anyone admitting it out loud. Tavita had worked at Halloran & Sons Import for 2 years and 8 months. She handled the receivables, the payables, the reconciliation of accounts that didn't quite balance. Accounts that, she had come to understand, were never supposed to balance, because the columns that mattered were kept somewhere else entirely. She had not said anything about this. She had learned, young, that knowing things and saying things were entirely different calculations. Brendan Halloran, not her uncle, just her employer, though the resemblance in temperament was unsettling, had hired her because she was fast, accurate, and willing to work for wages that reflected neither quality. She had stayed because the rent in East Vancouver had gone up twice, and the alternatives were worse. She had stayed, and she had watched, and she had kept her own set of books in a notebook she carried in her coat pocket, the kind with the black and white marbled cover that cost $2 at Shoppers. She knew things she wasn't supposed to know. That was the problem. The night it unraveled, it was raining, the specific Vancouver rain that isn't dramatic, just relentless, the kind that soaks through your coat before you've walked half a block and makes everything smell like wet concrete and old leaves. Tavita had stayed late. She often stayed late. The office was warmer than her apartment, and the building had better Wi-Fi. She was reconciling a shipping manifest against a set of invoices that didn't match when she heard Brendan's voice through the wall. He had a voice like a leather chair, soft and expensive on the surface, with something hard underneath. He was on the phone. She wasn't listening on purpose, but the numbers she heard made her go very still. She recognized the account codes. She had created the account codes. Watching someone talk casually about $400,000 moving through a holding company she'd set up herself. A company she'd thought was for duty deferrals on legitimate imports. Was the kind of cognitive dissonance that takes a moment to process, like looking at a word until it stops meaning anything. She sat there with her pen hovering over the page. She understood then what her notebooks were worth. Not to her, to someone else. She did not quit the next morning. Quitting would have required her to know what to do next, and she did not know what to do next. She went in. She did her work. She ate a sandwich at her desk and answered emails, and did not look at Brendan when he walked through. She was very good at this. She had had a lot of practice. What she had not had practice with was being followed home. She noticed the car on the third day, a black SUV, different plates each time but the same scuff on the front bumper, parked just past the bus stop where she caught the 20. On the fourth day, she took a different route. On the fifth day, she found an envelope tucked inside her locker at work. Inside was a photograph of her apartment door, nothing written on it, just the photograph. She stood in the break room holding it and thought, with the strange clarity that comes from having run out of ordinary fear. Someone has already made a decision about me. I'm just waiting to find out what it is. It turned out she didn't have to wait long. Brendan called her into his office on a Friday. He was wearing his good suit, which he only wore when something needed to look legitimate, and he had his hands folded on the desk in the way of someone who has rehearsed the conversation several times. He told her with some regret that the company was restructuring. He told her that her position was being eliminated. He told her that there was, however, an opportunity, a consulting arrangement, a short-term contract, Really just a few weeks of work with one of their business partners, someone who needed exactly her kind of expertise. What kind of expertise? She asked. Discretion, Brendan said, and numbers. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the photograph in her locker. She thought about the car with the scuffed bumper. She thought about the account codes and the $400,000 and the 3 years of meticulous records she had kept in marbled notebooks because something in her had always known she was going to need them. "Who is the client?" she said. Brendan smiled the way people smile when the answer is the point. "His name is Callum," he said. "Ronan Callum." She knew the name. Everyone who paid attention to the right kind of silence knew the name. Ronan Callum ran what the city officially considered a private logistics and investment firm, headquartered in a glass tower in Cole Harbour. What the city unofficially considered was more complicated and rarely discussed in rooms with windows. He had been investigated 3 times by the RCMP and twice by an international task force. He had never been charged with anything. He employed, it was rumored, more lawyers than some small governments, and he had a reputation for 2 things: precision and patience. He did not, as far as anyone knew, do favors for struggling import companies run by men in good suits, which meant Brendan owed him something, and whatever Brendan owed, Tavita was apparently part of the payment. She drove home that night and sat in her car for 20 minutes before going upstairs. She thought about running. She had thought about running before, from her uncle's house at 16, from a relationship at 22 that had turned incrementally wrong, from cities and situations and versions of herself she'd needed to leave behind. She was tired of running. Running cost money she didn't have and energy she'd already spent. She went upstairs. She made tea. She opened her notebook and looked at the columns she'd kept for 2 years and 8 months. Then she called Brendan back and told him she'd take the meeting. The building in Cole Harbour was exactly what it looked like from the outside. Deliberately understated. The kind of architectural restraint that costs more than showiness. The lobby had real marble, not composite, and a security desk staffed by 2 men who smiled the way security personnel smile when they are not in fact there to help you. She was expected. That was somehow worse than not being expected. A woman met her at the elevator, mid-30s, precise haircut, carrying a tablet, and wearing the expression of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. She introduced herself as Mara and led Tavita to the 31st floor without offering small talk, which Tavita appreciated. The office she was shown into had floor-to-ceiling windows, facing the inlet. On a clear day, it would have been the kind of view that made you feel small in a beautiful way. It was raining, so the mountains were invisible, and the water was pewter grey, and the whole city looked like it was dissolving at the edges. She was alone in the room for 7 minutes. She counted. Then Ronan Callum walked in. He was taller than she'd expected. That was the first thing. The photographs she'd seen, in a newspaper profile from 4 years ago, in the background of a city hall event, hadn't captured the way he occupied space, the particular stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was a form of authority. He looked like a man who had been awake for 3 days and was functioning anyway. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been in the photographs. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone with an old injury. A hitch in the left shoulder, barely perceptible. But she noticed things like that. He sat across from her without offering a handshake. She didn't offer one either. He put a folder on the table between them. "You kept parallel records," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "For how long?" 2 years. 8 months. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise. More like a recalibration. "You knew what you were looking at. Not at first. By the end." He opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of pages she recognized immediately, her own handwriting, the marbled notebook, columns of figures and account codes and dates. Her stomach dropped, but she kept her face neutral. Someone had been through her apartment, or her bag, or both. "These are mine," she said. "They were yours." He looked at her steadily. "The question is what they're worth to you." She thought about being very afraid right now. She considered it carefully, the way she considered most things. Fear had its uses. Fear kept you paying attention, but fear that turned into panic was just expensive noise. That depends, she said, on what you're offering. For the first time, something that was not quite a smile crossed Ronan Callum's face. He didn't offer her money. That was surprising. He offered her a job, not a consulting arrangement, not a contract, a position, with a title that would have looked completely unremarkable on a corporate org chart and meant something else entirely in the context of his actual operations: financial oversight, internal audit. She would look at the books and tell him what she saw, and she would be very good at it, and she would be discreet. And in return, she would be paid a salary that would have made her 2019 self laugh out loud, and she would be, this was the word he used, flatly, without inflection, as though it were simply a logistical fact, protected. From Brendan, she said, among others. She looked at him. He looked back. He had the eyes of someone who had long since stopped using them for anything other than assessment. And if I say no, she said. You've already seen what you've seen, he said. Saying no doesn't change that. So this is the part where I have no choice. You have a choice, he said. You can leave this building and pretend the last 3 years didn't happen and see how long that works, or you can stay and do work you're clearly already doing, for someone who can actually use it. A pause. And who can ensure Brendan Halloran stops being your problem? She looked at the folder. Her own handwriting looked strange from this angle. I want 3 months, she said. Of what? Probationary. Both ways. If I don't like what I see in 3 months, I walk, unmolested. A silence that lasted long enough to mean something. 2 months, he said. 3. He picked up the folder. 6 weeks, and you keep the notebook copies. Encrypted, server I control, backed up somewhere you don't. Another pause, longer this time. 6 weeks, he said, with the backup. She thought about the apartment and the rain and the car, with the scuffed bumper and Brendan in his good suit explaining her away like a line item being reclassified. Fine, she said. She was good at the work. She'd always been good at the work. That wasn't new. What was new was doing it without the permanent low-grade anxiety of working inside a lie she wasn't supposed to notice. The operations she was auditing were criminal, in the technical and accurate sense of the word, but they were also meticulously structured, and there was something clarifying about numbers that didn't pretend to be something they weren't. She had an office on the 29th floor, with a view of the parking structure, which she preferred to the inlet view because it was less distracting. She arrived at 8. She left when the work was done. Mara brought her coffee without being asked, and after the first week started leaving it the way she actually drank it, which meant someone was paying attention, and she wasn't sure yet whether to find that comforting or unsettling. She didn't see Callum often. When she did, it was briefly. In a corridor, in the elevator, once in the small kitchen on 30, where she was making toast at 7:30 in the morning, and he came in looking like the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. He had a coffee in one hand and a phone in the other, and he glanced at her and said, "You're here early," in a way that wasn't quite an observation and wasn't quite a question. "You're here earlier," she said. He looked at the toast. "What is that?" "Peanut butter and banana. It's good." He looked at it with the expression of a man who had opinions about breakfast and was too tired to have them right now. He took his coffee and left. She ate the toast and went back to the 29th floor. This was not how she had expected the next chapter of her life to begin. She found the discrepancy on a Tuesday in week 4. It was small, the kind of thing that would have been invisible in the records she'd seen before, the kind of error that looked like a rounding adjustment, or a currency fluctuation, or just the ordinary imprecision of large numbers moved quickly through multiple jurisdictions. She almost missed it. She didn't miss it. She sat with it for 2 days. She rechecked the figures 4 times. She pulled the source documents and the correspondence logs and the wire transfer confirmations and ran the calculations 3 different ways and got the same answer every time. Someone inside the organization was skimming. Not a lot, not in absolute terms, but systematically, and for long enough that the total was significant, and with enough sophistication that whoever it was understood exactly how the books worked and where the soft spots were. She thought about this for a long time. The correct thing, the logical thing, the thing a person in her position did, was to take what she'd found to Callum. She was hired to do exactly this. She had no reason to protect whoever was doing it. She had no alliances here, no loyalties, no relationships complicated enough to make this complicated. She was also aware, acutely, that the person doing it clearly knew the operation well enough to hide inside it, which meant it was someone trusted, which meant the moment she handed this over, there would be consequences, and some of those consequences might not be the tidy, legal kind. She thought about that. She thought about the kind of woman who sat across from Ronan Callum in an office overlooking a grey harbour, and negotiated the terms of her own captivity into something livable. Who kept notebooks nobody asked her to keep. Who had been waiting her whole life for something to count that actually mattered. On Thursday morning, she emailed Mara and asked for 30 minutes with Callum. He came to her office, which was not what she'd expected. She'd expected to be summoned upstairs. He sat in the chair across from her desk covered in her color-coded flagging tape, and her $2 marbled notebooks and a ceramic mug that said Vancouver Public Library because she'd had it since undergrad and it held exactly the right amount of coffee. And he looked at the spreadsheets she pushed across to him. He didn't say anything for a long time. "You're certain?" he said finally. "I'm certain. How long?" 14 months that I can trace, possibly longer. But the records before that are incomplete. Another silence. This one had weight to it, the specific gravity of a decision being made in real time. "Do you know who?" he asked. She had thought about this too. She had thought about whether to tell him what she suspected, knowing she could be wrong, knowing the cost of being wrong in a situation like this was higher than the cost of being wrong in most situations she'd been in. She slid one more sheet across the desk. He looked at it. His jaw tightened fractionally. The only sign. "You did good work," he said. "It's what you hired me for." He stood. He picked up the sheet and left the other documents where they were, which meant he trusted her with them, which struck her as significant. At the door, he stopped. "Your 6 weeks is up Friday," he said, without turning around. "I know. The door's still open, if you want it to be." She looked at the spreadsheets on her desk, at the notebooks, at the mug from the library. She thought about her apartment, which she had quietly started to think of as temporary, with the kind of instinct that preceded decisions she hadn't quite made yet. "I'll let you know," she said. He left. She sat there for a while. Then she opened a new notebook, the fresh one she'd bought last week, not quite knowing why, and started a new set of columns. The problem with learning to read a ledger is that eventually you start applying it to everything. Debits and credits, what you've spent, what you're owed, the running balance of a life. Tavita had spent a long time on the wrong side of that balance. She knew what it felt like to be an expense someone else was managing, something to be reduced, deferred, written off when the cost got inconvenient. She was done being a line item. What she hadn't expected, couldn't have calculated, couldn't have entered into any column, was what happened in the weeks after. The way work became real work, consequential work, the kind that required everything she had. The way the organization slowly revealed itself to her, not as an abstraction or a threat, but as a machine with genuine logic, one that she was increasingly good at understanding. The way Callum knocked on her office door one evening when the floor was quiet, and said, without preamble, "You eat yet?" in the tone of someone who had decided to ask before they could think better of it. She hadn't. She told him so. He had 2 containers of takeout from the Thai place on Robson that she had mentioned once, offhandedly, 3 weeks ago. He'd brought chopsticks even though she always used a fork. He set it on the edge of her desk and sat in the chair across from her, and they ate in the kind of silence that was, she realized, not awkward at all, just quiet. Like the space between 2 people who had decided, without saying so, that the space was okay. "You're staying," he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't an assumption either. It was the rarest kind of statement. An opening. She thought about what it cost. She thought about what it had cost already. She thought about Brendan in his good suit, and the car with the scuffed bumper, and every room she'd made herself smaller to fit in, every column she'd kept in secret, because having a record was the only power she'd had. She thought about sitting across from him in an office overlooking a grey harbour and negotiating like she had something worth negotiating with. She had. She'd known it even then. "Yeah," she said. "I'm staying." He nodded. He picked up his container and his chopsticks and ate noodles in her office while the rain came down outside and the city lit up slowly in the dark. And Tavita opened her new notebook to the first page and began. Brendan Halloran's company filed for receivership 8 weeks later. It was noted in the business section of the Vancouver Sun in 4 sentences. Nobody followed up. The man who had been skimming, one of Callum's longest-serving financial directors, trusted and careful and almost invisible, was not turned over to police. What happened to him was quieter than that and more permanent in its own way. And Tavita did not ask for details, because there were some accounts you didn't need to see itemized to know they'd been settled. She moved out of her apartment in Strathcona in November and into a place in Yaletown that she paid for herself, from her own salary, which was substantial enough now that she did not have to think about the food bank schedule or the cost of cigarettes relative to school lunch. The place had good windows and a second bedroom she set up as an office, and a view of the street below that she sometimes watched from with coffee in the library mug while the city went about its business. She thought sometimes about the woman she'd been, sitting in a car in the rain for 20 minutes, trying to decide whether to run. She didn't think about it with bitterness. More the way you think about a country you've emigrated from. It was where you're from, and the distance is real, and you don't wish it unmade. She had moved through the dark long enough to learn its shape. She knew which shadows held what. She knew the weight of silence and the precise calibration of trust, and what it meant when someone gave you the backup. She was, by any reasonable accounting, no one's victim. Callum told her this once, directly, which was not his usual mode, directness about anything that wasn't operational. It was late, and the office building was empty, except for the security desk. And he had walked past her door and seen the light on and come in without knocking, and they had been going over a logistics restructure for 40 minutes, when he stopped in the middle of a sentence and said, without particular inflection, "You know you're the most capable person in this building." She looked up. "Including me," he said, and went back to the document. She looked at him for a moment, the exhausted set of his shoulders, the left one he rolled sometimes when he'd been at a desk too long, the 3 days of not quite stubble because he forgot, not because he was trying for a look, the way he had handed her the backup because she'd asked for it, and he hadn't needed to think about it. "Don't flatter me," she said. "I don't," he said simply. She believed him. That was the thing. There is a kind of power that comes from being underestimated long enough that you stop caring about the estimation. You just do the work. You keep the books. You know what the columns say. Tavita had kept accounts her whole life. $43 in cigarettes. $6.15 at the food bank. 2 years and 8 months of parallel records in a $2 notebook because something in her had always known she would need them. She had known what she was worth. She had just been waiting for the calculation to catch up. It had.